Hey Heidi, shall we start?
Perfect. Hi and welcome everyone to the session Managing Risk from Marine Litter and Plastic Pollution. My name is Heidi Savelli, work for the United Nations Environment Program based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'm joined by Simon.
Yeah, warm welcome for me too. My name is Simon Jungblut. I am working at the University of Bremen in Germany as a project manager for an Arctic EU project. And I'm also one of the funders and co-organizers of ICMARE, which is an international conference for young marine researchers. Thanks for being with us, Heidi, and introducing us to this very interesting topic, managing risks from marine litter and plastic pollution.
Thanks and welcome everyone. So we will dive into a short presentation and then we'll have the opportunity to discuss some of these issues around risk and how to manage, but also what are opportunities in highlighting risks to businesses and other actors, of course, as well. I wanted to let you know that if you would like to zoom in on the presentation, at the bottom of the screen, you have the option to expand the presentation so that you can see it better. And some of these figures are more illustrative and they are available, and I will share the chat in the chat box also how to access them so you can go through them more in detail. So when we look at the issue around managing risk from marine litter and plastic pollution, we recently launched a report, UNEP, a couple of weeks ago, which is looking at From Pollution to Solution, a global assessment of marine litter and plastic pollution. And I'll just run through very high-level summarized findings that are relevant to the topic more than going into all of them, and highlighting to start with, of course, the amounts of marine litter and plastic pollution that have been growing so rapidly, with projections looking at emissions of plastic waste into aquatic ecosystems are projected to nearly triple by 2040. We also know that it does present a serious threat to all marine life, while it also has some impacts on climate, both from emissions, but also from affecting carbon sequestering ecosystems. We see that human health and well-being are at risk. These are some of the findings. There are also a lot of risks to various aspects of the global economy, and there are many hidden costs for the global economy. Marine litter and plastics are, of course, threat multipliers. We'll zoom in on that a little bit more. And of course, we are in the situation where the things are not going to get better anytime soon. So we need to look at how to best manage risk in the context and the situation that we're in, but also looking ahead at where are we heading and what are opportunities for zooming in on different areas. Some of the future research priorities that were highlighted in this report were really to look at the development of a risk framework based on a full life cycle for marine litter and plastic pollution from source to sea, covering ecological, social, economic, and health effects. So if we're looking at the risk, the definition, so the likelihood that an undesirable state of reality, adverse effects, may occur as a result of natural events or human activities. Plastics very much human activity, which we need to manage. We know that there are multiple risks. There are direct risks and impacts of marine litter and plastics that affect both. These are biological impacts related to potential death, physical damage, increased spread of bacteria, reduction of fish populations. There are economic impacts, more related to productivity reduction, to reduce confidence in products. And there are also societal impacts, looking at more at human well-being reduction, experimental recreation reduction, and heritage loss. Looking at the exposure of humans to microplastics and nanoplastics, there are, of course, several routes for this, both through ingestion, through inhalation, and also from nanoplastics across skin. Some studies have been looking at this particular area. And as I mentioned, these are more available in the chat. I'll share the link so that you can go through them more in detail. There are, of course, also human health impacts from exposure to plastic-associated chemicals, and these range from plasticizers and also flame retardants. Looking at both neurodevelopment disorders, affection, hormonal, respiratory disease, also metabolic disease impacts, and potential risks or some risks also on the decreased antibody response to vaccines have been found by some studies. as well as reproductive health in adults with potential impacts also on offspring. Looking at some of the social impacts, of course, the more traditionally, the risk of reduced welfare are posed by deterring people from visiting beaches, the knowledge that there are a lot of impacts that both are seen looking at charismatic marine animals, but also impacts that we are seeing around us, the decrease in a healthy environment, and also the destruction and loss of ecosystems with cultural and social importance, especially for some communities such as indigenous peoples. So if we look at a risk framework, what would a risk framework include and contain and consider? Well, there are multiple risks, of course, that are interconnected, and these need to be tackled in a very systematic, holistic manner to be able to address them. As mentioned, these plastics and marine litter can act as threat multipliers, and they are stressors that, in combination with other stressors, such as climate change, they will result in a far greater damage than when they are considered in isolation. And here, looking at especially some of the emerging findings on the effects of plastics on coastal ecosystems, when they are very important for mitigation around climate and also adaptation in many regions. There is also social aspects need to be considered, including gender aspects, which have many times been neglected when looking at risks, and also look at the long-term effectiveness of different actions and policies that need to be assessed in light of potential risks or emerging risks. So such a risk framework could contribute to both a better understanding of the different multiple cascading risks, including the wide range of potential hazards and exposure routes, and also the interactions and the interconnectedness between such. It could include looking at assessing the various impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, including not only the direct impacts, but also secondary consequences of such impacts and risks. It could lead to prioritization and design of actions to tackle the issue in a more holistic and coherent manner. It could inform risk management also, based on evidence taking into account various aspects. And it could also highlight where knowledge gaps are existing. As an additional thing is, of course, that it can ensure management options for reducing risks, and that these are based on a clear understanding of where the nature is and the magnitude of these risks. I wanted to highlight, of course, that risks can be very much relevant for insurance industry, for example. In 2019, UNEP developed a report together with the UNEP Finance Initiative and the Global Partnership on Marine Litter, looking especially at what are business risks related to plastic pollution. So we did a survey amongst multiple insurance companies and asked them where do they see the risks from their side. Many of them highlighted risks related to liability, to marine area aspects, and also to health. And in particularly, they zoomed in on a few different risks. There are, of course, physical risks, and the physical risks can be possible impacts to human health from microplastics, for example. It could also be impacts for entanglement of vessels in fishing gear, where hundreds of thousands of dollars may be spent on both repair but also safe recovery from maritime disasters. There are, of course, the issue of reputational risks, and here public interest is very much tied into it. Google searches have skyrocketed on what plastics impacts are, what plastics, what the effects they could have, but also who are the main plastic polluters. So here you have reputational risks that come at hand. The liability risks could, of course, be associated with chemicals that are related or associated with plastics, but it could also be liability for not managing plastic waste. And there are also a very fundamental one that if you're looking at transition risks, if a polluter pays principle would be implemented, then that would also, of course, look at the externalities that plastic pollution and marine litter are not currently being taken into account when managing this issue. So I'd like to with that, start the discussion and see if there are any questions at the moment, or if we can hear any other thoughts and ideas around the issue of risks.
Thank you very much, Heidi. The participants, you can still activate your camera, you can use the chat, you can use the raise hand function, and I will try to have a look on everything at the same time. But Heidi, as long as others are still typing or searching the camera switching off on function, you said that the pollution impacts the climate as well. Could you elaborate on that? How is pollution or plastics, for example, impacting the climate itself?
Yeah, so there could be different aspects to consider, both in terms of impact on ecosystems that may be carbon sequestering. So these might be ecosystems such as mangroves, coral reefs are not really carbon sequestering, but impacts on ecosystems that are trying to sequester carbon. In addition, you have the emissions from production, but you could also have emissions from burning of waste. So these are just some of the examples, but the report outlines much more in detail. So this.
Okay. We got a first, I think Stephen was the quickest one. Who would you like the consumers of the risk management framework to be?
So I think this is an interesting question, because I think when you're managing risk, it depends on what context you're within. It could be a government looking at risks to economies, for example, where tourism and where fisheries may be main economies that are potentially at risk or that could be impacted from the issue of plastic pollution through either ghost gear or through just lack of tourists want to come to polluted beaches. So when looking at the risk framework, you can first identify what the priority is that a particular user or user group are interested in, and then from there assess what are the direct risks, what are indirect risks to this. But the development of the risk framework is something that we are embarking on now. And there's of course been excellent work done by the joint group of experts on scientific aspects of marine environmental protection with the risk assessment workshop a few years ago. And they've just also started working more on the risk framework aspects. So we'll be collaborating with them as well and see how we can enhance and support these efforts.
So you're saying that on different levels you have different actors, right?
Yes.
Which would you consider the most important ones?
I think that it would be very interesting, both, of course, to mitigate and address immediate risks. So these are disproportionate impacts on communities, on certain species, on certain areas that are very sensitive. Like you need to kind of, I would zoom in on some of these aspects, because the level of exposure, of course, is something to be taken into consideration when kind of looking at prioritizing action. But then I think there's also a very interesting issue related to these reputational aspects, that if you look at where investors that are in a way driving the production cycle and also can have quite some influence in how things are shaped in a value chain, for example, then engaging investors in and outlining what are risks, but also what are the opportunities for addressing these risks in a comprehensive way by leading by example, for example, could be also other areas.
Thank you, Heidi. Olivera was switching on her camera. You want to ask personally?
Yeah, I'm actually typing in the question right now. I was kind of thinking it out loud, but first, a little shout out to Lund University alumni, so one of myself as well. But my question was a little bit about reporting in terms of the risk management framework. I'm kind of curious, is there a reporting form? Because we know there's an overproduction of information with a little bit of comparative possibility. A lot of people producing information, but little databases are actually present where we can actually assess the information and actually globally kind of compare what people are actually doing. So it's kind of parameter question more than
yes,
the framework output itself.
Great, and yeah, go ahead. So yes, so we are actually working with multiple partners to develop a global partnership marine to digital platform to try and pull together the excellent and super impressive work that so many actors are doing, both in terms of looking at what resources are available so that users, and this is a user-centered approach, so we're doing consultations, we're also shaping it so that it has to respond to user needs. Otherwise, it's no point in doing it. And trying to pull together information and also data resources so that you could use something like a platform like that, supported by, for example, there's some discussions with Arthur that I also see in the group on how also monitoring systems can support identification of where some risks exist, but also potentially anticipate where some risks may occur. So if you're looking at shipping routes, if you're looking at high-level areas for fishing, if you're looking at where sensitive species are migrating or where you have sensitive areas, by kind of overlaying these type of data layers and also keeping track of monitoring where are flows, where are sinks, then you could use something like this in the future. It's work in progress, and to actually kind of direct where you could have put effort, depending on, of course, what your priority is as an actor. So this is the gpmarineLitter.org digital platform. I'll share it in the chat and welcome anyone online, of course, to come up any ideas and thoughts on how to improve this platform, but also in engaging with us in shaping this type of risk framework going forward. Very, very welcome.
Because you were talking about this platform already now, I guess from my personal point of view, it makes sense to start with the most pressing risks, right? To fill up this platform. But which risks would you consider kind of acceptable in a way? And I'm also curious to hear about from others their opinion on what level actually are we talking about? So is the single motorboat equally important to the big tankers noise polluting the Atlantic?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from people online. Like, is any risk acceptable? And in of course, if you look at in a time frame, then you have maybe risks that need to be addressed in a short time frame because they are maybe more damaging to whether it's economies or ecosystems or anything.
Yeah, and Jörn wrote just in the chat, and who is deciding on the level? So at what level it's okay or kind of acceptable, the risk. That's totally right. Stephen is
I would say
asking,
that this is where indicators come into play. We usually don't have indicators developed based on people's perspectives. We usually have indicators based on scientific research in labs. So I think this is where the user-friendly perspective should come more into play. And then I see that Stephen mentioned that risks are calculated depending on years of data. And this is where citizen science and that kind of perspective can come into play. Then we don't have a decision on levels. The levels themselves are decided by society, and then risks themselves kind of come into play and show more so than people in command saying what risk is acceptable and what is not. But again, that's just a personal opinion, not.
Great. Additional thoughts?
in the chat, Heidi, you see one thought of Stephen, that in the insurance industry, risks are always calculated in values of money. And that depends on years and years of data, obviously, to calculate values of something. So those are several questions. So the data collection will be a key part of this evaluation, right? And is somebody, do you know or have an overview on who is collecting this data? And who will assess the value of the risk calculation itself?
So within insurance companies, you usually have risk assessment models for various aspects. So I think that by partnering with insurance companies, you may be able to also highlight the benefit for insurance companies to be part of, for example, a development of a risk framework on this. Of course, looking more at maybe the business areas that they are operating in. In the survey, they actually outlined there were 10 different areas where they looked at the issue of liability, marine, and health as the top ones. But also the issue of life was a bit further down. There was agriculture, engineering, and there was a number of other areas. I think really the the vision of a risk framework is something where multiple actors would need to be involved, especially not only focusing on the environmental aspects, but also I think the economic aspects and the concept of risks and opportunities to economies, because that's sometimes where you can get quite some good traction in engaging major players in shifting approaches, whether these are delivery systems or across value chains.
That's certainly true. Another question is also from Stephen. Losses in the marine environment, for example, a loss of a species at a certain place. How could these things be collected, and considered and compared in the end? So basically, what would be what would you consider the method in the end on how to compare, make things comparable, a loss of something?
Yeah, so you need to almost assign a type of, whether it's a societal value or a biodiversity value, not the value in monetary terms, but more looking at where is the prioritization for where is the highest risk if you're looking at a group of species or a different type of ecosystems, and where can you already start mitigating. So I think you can also look at what is the risk of things leaking into the environment. So you can actually have interventions around key leakage points, whether these are along a source to sea spatial concept or across life cycle and value chains. But these are, of course, excellent questions, and then we would very much welcome additional further discussions and see also engagement in how to develop a risk framework. So the group, GESAMP group, they started having a meeting last week where they pulled together a number of experts to discuss exactly these points that are being raised. And then we are also looking then at how to ensure that the issue of risks to financial systems and economies can be also better both calculated and assessed, looking towards future.
So I have one question to kind of add on. So you're saying that there are different risks, of course, future and present, but then should there be two different frameworks, the one assessing current risks and the one assessing future risks? They shouldn't necessarily mitigate and look at the same things. They're kind of portraying a different form of reality, in a sense.
No, I think when we're referring to framework, it's more that you could have various different type of risk assessment tools and approaches within a framework, and then depending on the situation that you would apply these into, or you could use them. So it's like almost like a toolbox.
Yeah, I understand that. I was just more so thinking about reporting. Then you will have to make reporting specific to those scenarios.
Yes, and I think this is where also baselines come in. So then, are you aware of what the current status is? Is there potential deterioration? Is there an improvement? And what are the management practices that you are trying to put in place to mitigate at least the deterioration at an initial stage? So having that baseline and the data aspects, of course, extremely important. I find it personally that sometimes impact data can be harder to come across because it's not necessarily always streamlined in an easy to find way. It might be, you may need to dig through a number of different either studies, or you look at, it's not reported in a coherent way many times, unless it is economic impact, where you could then work with insurance companies and learn a bit more about if they wish to share that information. Where have there been, for example, issues related to entanglement of vessels? What were the costs associated? Because we need to build a better understanding of the costs of impact and the costs of not doing anything. And I think that can then definitely drive the interest in taking more of a risk-based approach on to management interventions and prioritization of action.
Jörn was asking about the precautionary principle, how to apply that one. I'm not sure if this is a term I'm actually not familiar with, Heidi.
Yeah, it's more to you know, unless you have, if you have data, then you might be able to use that data to assess risk. But if you do not have the data, then it's better to be on the safe side rather than err going forward. So that's I mean, I guess a simplification of the precautionary principle. And then we have highlighted that in the case of nanoplastics, for example, while there isn't a lot of data and information specific to studies of nanoplastics and impacts in the human body, for example, then a precautionary approach would probably be a good consideration, looking at the potential impacts and in the reach of nanoplastics across cell membranes.
Steve was stating that the estimation of those natural capitals and the insurance against loss is a very difficult thing. That brings me to the question: how can we, account for regional, cultural, or also social differences globally? Because evidently, not everything is worth the same if you can't put money on it at all.
Yes, it would be super interesting to hear from the audience on some of these questions as well. But of course, yes, there are very large differences between regions in terms of exposure to chemicals, in terms of plastic waste management, in terms of how burning of waste, in terms of many different aspects. And I think having the flexibility, when you're looking at risk, is to consider the issue highlighted in the presentation a bit on. You have to look at the social aspects and also gender-related aspects.
Okay, any thoughts from the audience so far? Several people are typing. So if we account for these regional differences and also social and cultural differences, what would you kindly consider, in terms of people? Should they be managing at the more local or national level, or would you give kind of a guideline in terms from the UN and then level
Yes, I
it
think
top down?
something that's interesting in the concept of risk is who is responsible for addressing risk. Is that a governance issue? Is it a liability issue? Is it producers? Is it consumers? It depends a lot on what type of risk we're considering. But love to hear from the audience as well here.
Peter is asking, another issue is that ocean plastic will increase from 30 million tons annually to 30 million tons annually in the next 20 years. How about the risk of massive increase of ocean plastic? What impact will this increased amount have? Yes, and who should be dealing with it?
Yes, great question. And this is, of course, at the center of some of the discussions that will take place at the UN Environment Assembly in February, where countries are currently looking at, after 4 UNEAs, there have been resolutions on the topic. We have looked at the latest state of science, what are governance gaps. There's been an ad hoc open-ended experts group looking more from a scientific area. What are some barriers? What are some challenges? And at the moment, many countries are promoting to establish an intergovernmental negotiating committee to develop a global legally binding agreement on the issue. And this would, of course, be up to the countries to determine in February. But looking at the issue of governance, especially in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and where do you address this very much transboundary issue that it's impossible for one country or one actor to manage? So it's very, very interesting, the discussions and the negotiations will be initiated. There are 2 resolutions on the table at the moment, or 1 resolution and 1 working paper. And this would, of course, be negotiated and further discussed in the lead up to the UN Environment Assembly.
How do you feel about the kind of, because plastic is not equal plastic, right? There are different kinds of plastic and for different use. How do you feel about kind of these, who is causing the problem also is accountable for the problem?
Yeah,
Would that be feasible on an international level?
I think there are a lot of different considerations depending on which level you are at. Because of course it's users that are operating within different contexts have different opportunities to address the issue. But there should be, of course, the end goal should be to have zero leakage, just like the UNEA 3 kind of put as that's the goal. Let's try and reach there. One of the challenges is, of course, for target setting and for moving towards measuring actual impact on whether it's policies, whether it's shifting production patterns, whether it's phase out of certain products, is that the data is many times not there. What I think would be very interesting would be to look also at how do you map out get everyone together and look at mass balance across economies and within also ecosystems, so where you have sources sinks, but economies. Because right now we're dealing with multiple methodologies, we're dealing with modeled approaches, where quality data can really kind of support identifying also where you have the risks and where you may want to prioritize interventions. So this is another area of work that we are looking to try and convene the global community around trying to make progress of this, because it is relevant in the context of target setting. And one could start looking at bringing together those that have been working on mass balance before, that have data and information on different approaches for measuring this type of information, and then try and look towards how could something like that, having a more of a global mass balance with regional, of course, going down to regional and national levels, how could that support the governance of the issue?
Yeah. This connection of people is indeed what is also moving Arthur. Arthur was asking, how can we best promote such connections between, for example, local municipalities and then groups of scientists, for example, who are then providing data and expertise to develop such modeling and satellite and monitoring issues. And how can we foster use those case developments?
I wanted to start on the issue of access to information, actually, a little bit, because in order to engage people, there needs to be in a way of also seeing what are the risks or opportunities or benefits to me, to my family, to my community. And I think access to information here is crucial for people to engage further on the topic. It might be engaged, many may know that there is a pollution aspect, of course, to it. It's a very visual problem, but everyone might not know what the potential health risks or what are risks to my income, or how will my kind of economy change ahead if actual very ambitious action is not taken at different levels. So I kind of wanted to zoom in on that, the sharing of information and access to reliable information.
Stephen is completely right. Such treaties on international level take years and years. We see that with the Paris Agreement, also establishing MPAs, for example, in polar regions. This takes ages, and during this time, plastic is the pollution goes on, right? How do you feel about a certain type of top-down control on a national level? Because in Germany, for example, we unfortunately still don't have a plastic bag ban, yet other countries have that already. How would you approach this? Is UN in the position to kind of push nations in a certain direction in terms of banning single-use plastics, as fortunately goes in the EU at some point?
We encouraging kind of consideration around what are the most problematic, the unnecessary, the problematic, and the avoidable plastics. But our role is, of course, to provide the evidence base for why are these unnecessary, avoidable, or problematic. And then, of course, that will differ between different countries. What might be problematic in one country might be less so in another, with different collection systems. But ultimately, of course, it's about reducing the pressure on the system, where there is a lot of unnecessary plastic, and there are opportunities for avoiding certain types. And here again, the issue of data can be really supporting in looking at what are the most leaked items, but also what are the items that really can be removed. But very much national context at that point, at that level. There has been the Clean Seas campaign over the last 5 years that has been highlighting the problem around single-use plastics. We're now moving in to focus more on the whole more broader issue about unnecessary, avoidable, problematic plastics. Also focusing on not only on the marine aspect, but looking at landlocked countries, having that connectivity, looking at freshwater environments and other types of environments to engage countries. Ultimately, it's the decision of the countries, of course, but we're also working with countries on development of national action plans through national source inventory approaches. So identifying what data and information is available, what data and information may the country need to or wish to try and collect, and also what are the policy situations. So you do policy inventory, which are the policies that are available at the moment, what could be potential opportunities for a country to consider depending on what they have identified as priority areas. And here we're also trying to promote exchange between countries. So a country might have developed an action plan, another country can learn a lot from the challenges or from the success stories that countries have. So this is what we're doing also with the Global Partnership for Marine Litter and the digital platform to try and connect stakeholders through the connect stakeholder component. But of course, still a lot of work needs to be done, but we will be working with 8 countries initially in Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa to start with. And there's, of course, been a lot of progress at national level in Asia Pacific as well. So very, very interesting times. And the action plan development is, of course, at the center of any kind of future potential mandate for any global agreement, where there would always be national level aspects that the countries will agree on.
I am personally totally unaware if this is still a thing that countries are kind of trading their own plastic scrap rubbish to other countries just to get rid of it themselves. Is that still a thing? Is there a trend visible? Does that go down or is it going up? Is the greenwashing a thing of several countries so that they're getting rid of their plastic scrap to other countries?
So this is when the Basel Convention, the amendments to the annexes have also entered into force, and that aims to regulate and also provide guidance on how to ensure that there isn't that type of kind of indiscriminate trade in shipping trade, plastic waste from one country to another. But I'll probably not deep dive into the provisions of the Basel Convention Annex at the moment, but I'd encourage anyone that's interested in more information on that to visit their website, because there are a lot of very, very interesting information. We also did a vital graphics, which I can also make available together with the Basel Convention Secretariat, which also outlines in a quite visual and a bit nice way, not too super scientific, some of the issues around the plastic waste trade as well. So there is some materials there. It's interesting that you're mentioning greenwashing, because there is also, in relation to the liability aspects, there are emerging court cases more around greenwashing in relation to over-promising by sometimes businesses, for example. So these are things that are emerging. So we're also trying to see what has happened so far, or what are examples, Because these are, of course, also good for businesses to be aware of, that there is a need to really do what you're saying you're doing.
Okay. Oliveira is asking if if education on the local level would benefit from using a uniform risk assessment framework. So would that help in a way for plastic pollution? So could this be broken down for education on a local level?
I think so. And what we have had a massive open online course on the issue for many years. We're currently updating it, and what we want to include is also more of a description about risk framework, but how can it be applied? I think as an initial approach, one could look at engaging through citizen science, for example, because by doing a combination of citizen science monitoring and also some brand audits, you could also look at what are the kind of accumulations you're seeing. Are you seeing impacts? So kind of look around and also see where additional information might have already been collected in the community or in the country, and who else is doing it. So it's a too big issue, of course, for one person or one entity to try and deal with, but we're really trying to facilitate connections between different bodies of work, but also different entities. And we will be offering this massive open course going forward next year as well in an updated format. So hopefully, I'll definitely keep this in mind. So thank you.
Because you just mentioned the course, you had a course, an online course, you said. Where can people find such online courses if they're interested in further diving into this topic?
So yes, on the digital platform I mentioned, but not shared the link in yet. I will. And then that's what we're working on right now. So we're in phase 3. We're focusing on the capacity building part of the platform. So we just had some user consultations. We'll continue. And that's including both collecting resources, mapping them, but also identifying kind of what are some of the gaps that are there, and what are different ways of capacity building, because there are many ways, and not, one approach will not work for everything. But there we are pulling together what everyone is doing, and we had a good proposal in the session yesterday to also ensure that we're looking ahead with others, what their plans are. So not only what is in place, but what are plans of major programs, major initiatives on capacity building, because maybe then we could already at a pretty earlier stage start looking at how we can integrate some resources as well and make it more flexible through the platform.
Excellent.
And yes, I see Stephen here. So yes, we work with UNEP-FI as well on the report that I mentioned on the liability, on the insurance company aspect. And I think they're doing extremely interesting work, and we're continuing dialoguing. They're UNEP-FI, or non-UNEP. So we're, of course, working closely together. So excellent.
What is FI? Excuse me.
The finance, yes, the finance initiative.
Finance initiative.
Working very much with insurers, investors.
Mm-hmm. Oh, excellent. That's good. What about liability? So when we are discussing such risks, and we also want to handle those, should we also discuss liability?
Yes, and I think it would be interesting to hear also from others on the line around the issue of liability, because risk is something it's affected. I mean, we're all affected by this in a way or another, the issue of litter and pollution. So what's our sense? Like, what would we as a global community or individuals or would like to see? And I think when we're looking at liability, then many times it's very difficult to track back. Like, you may have certain types of chemicals, but you may have multiple chemicals in a body. So how do you attribute a certain effect to a particular chemical, for example.
Mhm.
If you have a vessel and it's costing you thousands of dollars to fix that vessel because you collided with the container or with your propeller has been ensnared into any kind of derelict fishing gear, where is the liability there? Many times it will be, of course, potentially, if there is insurance, this might be covered under there. And I think insurance companies may have it a bit more on their radar, the issue of plastic pollution and marine litter. But otherwise, the issue of liability, I think it's an area where a lot of work could be done more going ahead, especially in areas beyond national jurisdiction. You can look at flow models, you can look at assessing also where is waste from one country ending up, because that's, of course, another area of potential conflict or at least sensitivities between, for example, whether it's neighboring countries or countries from different regions.
Yeah.
So tracking, in a way, better ahead. Yes, but that would mean different new research approaches, new monitoring approaches, many different.
So that also means in climate change issues, you sometimes hear the term climate justice. So that, for example, the global north is kind of dragging the global south into climate change problems. Is there a similar term, kind of pollution justice, also a discussion point in the community? Because I guess it's similar, right? The global north is kind of responsible for a lot of pollution. Other countries are not. This is also touching the issue of liability, of course. Is this a discussion point?
There are a lot of discussions around means of implementation and ensuring that in the some of the proposals going to UNIA, there have also been kind of statements around ensuring that countries and actors that are important in this regard will need to be engaged and part of that. There have been more discussions around environmental justice, again, disproportionate impacts, not discussions in the UN, like amongst the countries always, but the special rapporteurs have been quite vocal and engaged in the different processes and discussions around litter and plastic pollution. And of course, there was the decision a couple of weeks ago around that a healthy and clean environment is a human right, which is, of course, very, very interesting and could, I think, trigger a lot of interesting discussions and thoughts going forward as well as to how to ensure that we have a clean ocean in the end.
And this is also probably triggering a lot of interesting court cases in the future. If it's a human right, a clean environment. You were talking about disproportionate risks. Could you give us some examples on those?
This might be, for example, in the EU looked at what were the top 10 items that they were finding on the beaches. They took different policy approaches for it, but they also considered fishing gear because of the disproportionate impact that fishing gear has, both in terms of impact on ecosystems, but also relation to, for example, ghost fishing. So I think one can assess whether something has a disproportionate impact, and that can differ in different contexts as well. But of course, if you are a fishing community and you have massive amounts of waste coming out from a river not far from you, and what you're getting up in the nets is 80% plastics, then I would say that's also a disproportionate impact on that community and their income. I think a lot is very context specific. So if you look, you can consider developing something that's very flexible and really also not focusing only on bigger aspects, but really zooming into a community level, which I see a lot of highlighted in the comments, which I think is really, really important.
Excellent. Are there questions or remarks from the audience? Feel free to speak up anytime.
Yes, I see one question around tracking pollution. Yes, so there are a lot of modeling and methodology approaches looking at how flows are in the environment and where they're coming from. So yes, you could put in place trackers in a way. You could look at where are a lot of leakage entering along, for example, a shared river basin. And we're working with the UNEP DHI in Denmark to look at also using the models and the approaches that they have developed for SDG 6.6, more freshwater type, and looking at the type of an early warning system pilot on how to assess increased risks for flow. Along some rivers, in some regions, you would have very much, you will have an increase in flow of rain, for example, during monsoon seasons. So then the risk would differ between different seasons. Also, if you are putting waste next to a riverbed and you are in the wrong season, then the risk would be higher. So they are working on something like that. So we hope to be able to kind of introduce it and discuss it more in a pilot setting at early next year, probably, and feed into the digital platform. At the moment, we've been connecting also different entities working on models and methodology. And again, like data is crucial. We have to improve the data. Meanwhile, we're connecting, for example, UNEP DHI working on the freshwater model with University of Leeds. That's been working more on leakage from at city level with UN Habitat. That's been working with us on going into cities to do waste characterization data, assess flows, and also look at challenges and opportunities, both for policy aspects, but also for infrastructure investments to scale. And then also with Florida State University, looking into the plastics flow model that we have. Again, looking at the interconnectivity between regions and zooming in on the Caribbean as a start.
From your point of view, because you are now mentioning a lot of different players as well, what would be, from your point of view, the most pressing and urgent thing? So what's next?
There's so much to do.
Yeah.
But that's why there are so many players that have entered over the last couple of years, and this is brilliant. It's just now also, like, how can we convene communities of practice? How can we make sure that we are not duplicating? Because we don't really have time to be doing the same things, everyone. And if we can also come together and can we all create one mass balance that the countries can kind of, that the scientific communities can come together around and say, okay, it's not perfect, but at the moment, this might be something that we can continue working on. And then look at, okay, who could do what? So I feel like that would be such an achievement to bring together the different actors in really kind of pulling all forward in some targeted approaches. I'm getting a call here on the side. Are we on time with the...
I thought so. We have time until 20 past, as far as I have the agenda.
Sorry.
Feel free to take the call, otherwise.
No, it's stopped. So, but it was from Germany. So.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Olga. You were talking about what would be nice to have in the future, but what will actually happen in the next time. So what's the timeline? What's your timeline on fighting the pollution aspect?
Well, I think there are many different timelines, but right now we are looking towards what decisions would come out of UNEA, what would countries decide on, whatever that might be. But meanwhile, there's no time to lose. So what we will be doing in the beginning of December is to start convening the Global Partnership on Litter action tracks, where we would be trying to get groups together to try and work together on some of the different topics. These include mass balance. It includes the risk framework. It includes also increasing some of the understanding around unnecessary problematic plastics, but also strengthen monitoring and try and see where can different actors support countries in collecting and generating the data that many of them may not have at the moment. Because of course that will facilitate and it will also enable evidence-based decision making.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I see there is something going on in the live stream already. Heidi, or also from the participants, some final words. Do you feel like the Ocean Decade is pushing this topic into a beneficial direction?
Yes, I think the opportunity that the Ocean Decade provides, again, to convene actors, again, to try and move things forward in different streams. I think this is extremely important. And we're very happy to continue working with the Decade and support efforts. And we also happy to connect and link whatever we are working on, so that we can together achieve something that's bigger than the sum of its parts.
That's a very nice closing word. Yeah, thank you very much, Heidi. Thank you very much for the people participating in the discussion or just listening. That's fine. I guess the artistic break is running at the moment. So I think we have to switch over to the main room again, as far as I see. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. And yeah, if there are some more questions, I'm pretty sure Heidi is happy to answer at some point during the event or maybe later. I'm the pollution expert, but if you have questions to me, also feel free to email me. Yeah, it was a pleasure, Heidi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
See you soon at the next event.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.